My hands trembled as I signed my son's surgery consent form. How did it come to this? While listening to footsteps echoing in the white hospital corridor, memories of recent days flashed through my mind like a film reel. It was a morning when Arizona's scorching sun blazed overhead. As usual, I was sipping coffee in the living room before heading to work. My mother-in-law Martha carried homemade pancakes with such grace that she looked like a waitress from a luxury hotel. "Have a good day, Linda," she smiled, but there was something calculated and cold lurking behind that smile. "I'm Linda Parker. As a branch manager in the insurance division of Phoenix, I've achieved 3 promotions over my 10-year career. Though small in stature, I make an effort to maintain a dignified presence. It's my way of surviving in a male-dominated world. My son Tommy is 10 years old. He's a quiet, reserved child, and lately his grades have been slipping a bit. What concerns me is his habit of wearing long sleeves and pants despite Arizona's heat. When I ask, "Aren't you hot?" he just shakes his head. And in front of his grandmother Martha, he freezes up like he's turned to ice. My husband Greg works as a mid-level architect at a design firm. While outwardly gentle and gentlemanly, his self-esteem seems wounded by recent work failures. He's heavily dependent on his mother Martha, sometimes showing childlike expressions. Martha, my mother-in-law, is a strong woman who raised Greg alone after divorcing 30 years ago. A former housewife, she now pours her passion into her grandson's education. On the surface, she plays the role of the ideal grandmother and has an excellent reputation in the neighborhood. However, behind that smile lay a compulsive obsession with the perfect family. 7 years ago, Greg and I met while finalizing a real estate contract. During our insurance policy meetings, I was drawn to his gentlemanly manner and sincere dedication to his work. When I decided to marry him, living with Martha was presented as a condition. I didn't think much of it at the time. Rather, I thought she would be a strong support system as I struggled to balance work and childcare. However, I began to sense something was off soon after we started living together. Martha's over-involvement began with small daily matters. "Linda, this food is too heavily seasoned, you should fold Tommy's clothes like this." While each incident seemed trivial, as they accumulated, I felt my place in the household gradually shrinking. In a quiet suburban neighborhood of Phoenix stood our Spanish colonial revival-style house with its dazzling white walls. On the surface, we were the ideal 3-generation family. Well regarded by neighbors and active in the church community, we never missed Sunday Mass at St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church, followed by walks through the Desert Botanical Garden. The perfect way to spend a Sunday. But beneath this perfection, a twisted power dynamic was quietly taking hold. I would leave early for work and return late at night. During those hours, Martha had complete control over Tommy's education. "Since your mother is busy with work, Grandma will take care of you." At the time, I didn't understand the weight those words carried. Dressed in Brooks Brothers suits, I projected confidence as a sales manager at work. Yet in front of Martha, who smiled gracefully in her Talbot's outfits, I somehow felt diminished. Greg, too, despite his gentlemanly appearance in Ralph Lauren casual wear, was submissive as a child before his mother. And Tommy, in his Gap Kids long-sleeved shirts, always kept his head down. The living room displayed family photos with perfect smiles. Tommy's room was unnaturally tidy, and a security system with surveillance cameras watched over the family 24 hours a day. The ideal household. It was like a perfect painting crafted by Martha. Staring at the family photos in the living room, I let out a deep sigh. Behind those seemingly perfect family smiles, an unsettling feeling that something important had been left behind was gradually growing in a corner of my mind. However, I didn't even have the luxury to explore the source of this unease. One weekday afternoon, my cell phone rang during a meeting. The call from St. Joseph's Memorial Hospital filled me with ice-cold anxiety. But the events leading up to that call had already told the story of what was happening to my son. The previous night, when I returned home, I heard my mother-in-law's voice from the living room. "With grades like these, can you really call yourself a Parker?" Despite it being past 10 p.m., Tommy was being forced to sit in formal siza position, being harshly scolded over his report card. Usually, I would have quietly headed upstairs to the bedroom, but that night I stopped in my tracks. "Mother, it's getting late." "Linda, be quiet. You're always at work and know nothing about Tommy's education." Martha's cold words left me speechless. From the corner of my eye, I could see Tommy desperately biting his trembling lips. I noticed his knees were red and swollen from sitting in siza for so long, but I couldn't say anything more. The next morning, Tommy's breakfast was less than half the usual portion. "The reason your grades are dropping is because you're overweight. This much is plenty." Tommy just nodded slightly to Martha's smiling comment. His back seemed even more hunched than usual. I quickly drained my coffee and said, "I'm leaving." As usual, there was no response. That day at 3:15 p.m., under Arizona's intense sunlight, an accident occurred at a crosswalk 3 blocks from school. According to the security camera footage, Tommy had been limping as he walked. As he tried to cross at the green light, his small body suddenly pitched forward. A car making a right turn hit the brakes, but it was too late. The child suddenly collapsed and fell, a female witness testified to the police. When I rushed to the hospital, Tommy was receiving emergency treatment. The diagnosis: a broken right leg, full body contusions, and suspected head trauma. Though conscious, he couldn't stop crying from the pain. "Surgery will be necessary," the doctor's words made my mind go blank. Just then, the hospital room door burst open. "Surgery? Don't be ridiculous." Greg stormed in, shouting. Martha stood behind him. "Greg? Why? Don't do anything unnecessary. I'm taking my son home right now." My husband tried to approach Tommy's bed. Under the fluorescent lights, his face was pale. "Wait. The doctor says he needs surgery." I desperately tried to stop Greg. But his eyes held an abnormal gleam. "Shut up. What do you know?" He tried to push me aside. In that instant, I instinctively stood between him and Tommy. "Stop. Don't frighten Tommy." My son was trembling, curled up in his bed. Seeing him like that, something inside me snapped. "If you're going to interfere, this means divorce." Greg's shout echoed down the hallway. I could hear nurses rushing toward us. In the midst of the chaos, I held my son's small hand tightly. "It's okay, Tommy. Mama will protect you." Those words felt like the first time in 7 years that I had truly spoken to my son as a mother. In the corner of the room, I caught sight of Martha talking on her cell phone. Her expression showed a panic I'd never seen before. Events began moving rapidly. A senior nurse, accompanied by security, entered the room. Her quiet but authoritative voice cut through the chaotic atmosphere. "What's happening here?" Greg instantly tried to compose himself, attempting to return to his usual gentlemanly manner. However, his eyes still held that dangerous light. Martha too put away her phone and approached with her elegant smile. "Just a minor family disagreement. We can handle this ourselves." But the head nurse cut off Martha's words with a resolute attitude. "Patient safety comes first. Would the family please wait in the waiting room?" Just then, footsteps were heard from the hallway. A female detective in her 50s and a young male detective entered the room. "Mrs. Parker, may we have a moment of your time?" Detective Johnson's voice had a strangely calming effect. As we moved to the waiting room, Greg and Martha raised objections but were silenced by the young detective's firm demeanor. "We received a report from the nurses," Detective Johnson began quietly. "May we discuss Tommy's test results?" At that moment, the attending physician entered with documents in hand. "We found some serious issues." The X-rays in the doctor's hands showed multiple old fracture marks glowing white. "These fractures are from at least within the past year. Also," the doctor paused, "we found both old and new bruises all over his body. Furthermore, there are signs of chronic malnutrition." Fragmented memories began rapidly connecting in my mind. Tommy's refusal to take off his long-sleeved shirts. The gradually decreasing meal portions. Late-night sizes sessions. In our family, that couldn't be. The words squeezed out of my throat. However, Detective Johnson gently but surely led me toward the truth. "Ma'am, we've also received information from Tommy's teacher. Frequent absences, and the explanation of falling. Medical records from different hospitals each time." Memories came flooding back. The blue bruise I found on Tommy's arm that day. My son's trembling voice saying I fell down the stairs. Martha's words, "Children fall all the time." Everything connected. "We must be a perfect family." That was Martha's mantra. But the pursuit of that perfection had transformed into obsessive control. If grades dropped, there would be all-night scolding sessions. Meals were strictly limited, and even minor mistakes were met with ruthless physical punishment. And Greg, my husband, raised under his mother's absolute control since childhood, had internalized this twisted love as normal. Recent failures at work had wounded his self-esteem, and like his mother, he was resolving his frustrations through violence. Why didn't I notice? My voice trembled. Consumed by daily work, I had used late returns home as an excuse to ignore the abnormality before my eyes. Perhaps my own obsession with being a good wife had dulled my maternal instincts. Detective Johnson quietly pulled out Tommy's statement. It detailed a daily life I knew nothing about. Planned violence by Greg and Martha. Instructions on clothing to hide the scars. Changing hospitals for each examination. And above all, My son's desperate endurance while being crushed by the fear that he couldn't tell anyone. I didn't want to worry Mom. Reading Tommy's testimony, tears streamed from my eyes. But they were tears of both regret and determination. I won't let anyone hurt my son anymore. When I spoke those words, my mind was surprisingly clear. In the hallway, I could see Greg and Martha being escorted by police officers. Their elegant smiles and gentlemanly demeanor had vanished. I signed the consent form handed to me by the nurse without hesitation. This would be a new beginning. The first step toward truly protecting my son and rebuilding our family in the real sense. At that moment, I heard my son's peaceful breathing from his hospital room for the first time in a long while. As if he had been freed from all his burdens. The head nurse quietly approached me. "Ma'am, there's one more thing." In her hands was security camera footage. It showed not just the moment of the accident, but Tommy's condition on his way home from school. A small figure limping, occasionally stopping to catch his breath. The sight pierced my heart even deeper. Detective Johnson approached again. "The Child Protective Services representative has arrived. We'd like to discuss specific next steps, if that's all right." I nodded deeply at those words. This was the first step of a long journey ahead. It wouldn't be easy. But there was no turning back. I had to face this reality to protect my son and build a new life. The next morning, Detective Johnson visited with a detailed report. "The arrests have been completed." Her voice carried definite weight. The facts revealed during the investigation far exceeded my imagination. A parenting journal found at Martha's home contained detailed records of abuse spanning over 2 years. Necessary guidance for building the perfect family. The journal, titled as such, contained evidence of calculated control. June 15, Tommy, 85 points on math test. Though passing, insufficient for a Parker. Implemented dinner restriction and 3 hours of SISA. July 2, Linda's interference becoming noticeable. Should not meddle in son's education. Instructed Greg to limit wife's involvement. August 20, Tommy's weight 2 kilograms above age average. Strengthening dietary restrictions. Instructed Greg to respond if defiant attitude observed. Greg's testimony revealed an even darker depth. "Mother is right. Mother who raised me alone can never be wrong," he reportedly kept shouting in the interrogation room. "The mistakes at work, the incompetence of subordinates, everyone else is to blame. As Mother says, they must be strictly corrected." 3 months later, the trial concluded. Greg received a 7-year prison sentence for child abuse. Martha was sentenced to 5 years for instigating and conspiring in the abuse. Their final expressions in court were like those of different people. "I wasn't wrong. This is love." Martha held on to her beliefs until the end. Greg, as if freed from his mother's spell, left the courtroom with a vacant expression. After the verdict, I filed for divorce mediation. Several letters arrived from Greg, but I never opened them. I couldn't bring the dark shadows of the past into our new life. The psychological analysis pointed to Greg's pathological dependence on his mother and the reproduction of abuse he himself had experienced. The sense of inferiority from his work failures was being healed through dominating the family. They were trapped in the illusion of a perfect family, the Child Protective Services counselor quietly explained. Martha's control was attempting to extend to the grandchild's generation through her son. Each time I faced the facts, my heart felt torn into thousands of pieces. Especially when I learned the cause of the accident, I nearly collapsed on the spot. Why couldn't I notice? To my whispered words, the detective quietly explained. Martha had performed perfect cover-ups. Hiding injuries before I returned home, specifying long-sleeved uniforms, changing hospitals for each visit, and explaining absences to school with the refined excuse of family issues. And above all, my own lifestyle had created conditions that allowed the abuse to go unnoticed. Leaving for work at 7 a.m., returning after 9 p.m. Overtime for promotions, working on holidays. Leaving almost all childcare to Martha, unable to spend time with my son. I wanted to be the ideal wife, the ideal mother. I wiped my tears. But I never imagined that wish would end up hurting my son. The night before the accident, Tommy was forced to sit in CISA until late, the officer continued. Using his report card grades as justification, Martha made him sit for over 4 hours without food. You were working overtime then too. The security cameras captured Tommy walking while dragging his feet. Blood circulation problems from CISA and malnutrition. The combined effects caused him to collapse like he was losing consciousness at the crosswalk. The accident wasn't a coincidence, but an inevitability brought about by long-term abuse. I couldn't protect Tommy. Though my chest felt crushed with regret, there was no time to dwell on it. We had to start a new life, just the two of us. The first step was moving. With support from my company, we were able to rent a unit in a high-rise apartment in Central Phoenix. An environment protected by 24-hour security. There was a park nearby, and the new school was within walking distance. Everything was fresh and safe. "Mom, the view from this room is beautiful," Tommy murmured one evening soon after moving in, looking down at the city from the balcony. A faint smile played on his profile. Psychological counseling twice a week. Overcoming trauma takes time, the counselor says. But Tommy is definitely moving forward. I also made big changes to my life. After discussion with my supervisor, I was allowed to work from home 3 days a week. This time, I'll achieve a true balance between work and family. My supervisor nodded deeply at those words. A new daily routine began. Doing homework together when Tommy returns from school, sometimes playing with his favorite Lego blocks, making dinner. I never thought these ordinary moments could feel so precious. "Hey, Mom," Tommy called out to me one night before bed. "I'm not scared anymore. Because you're here with me." At those words, I couldn't help but hug my son tightly. The wounds haven't completely healed. He still has nightmares sometimes. But we were definitely moving forward. Saturday mornings are for jogging in the park. Sundays are for reading at the library. And once a month, we have small adventures to the zoo or museum. New habits are gradually adding color to our lives. Compared to our former life in the luxurious house, it might seem modest. But in this small apartment, I feel like we've finally become a real family in the truest sense. Let's do our best tomorrow too. We say this to each other every night. It's not just a greeting, but a small yet certain pledge to our new life. Outside the window, Phoenix's night skyline sparkled. Quietly and warmly, as if waiting for a new morning. And our story, too, continues into a new chapter. Mom, look. One weekend at the park, Tommy came running up to me with a beaming smile. In his hands was a paper airplane he'd made with his friends. He told me he'd learned how to fold it with Michael, a new friend he'd met at school during recess. That's wonderful. It flies so well now, doesn't it? At my words, Tommy proudly puffed out his chest. There was no longer any trace of his former shrinking posture. His twice-weekly psychological counseling sessions had been reduced to once a month. At the recent parent-teacher conference, his teacher Mrs. Brown pointed out Tommy's changes. His improvement in science and math is remarkable. More importantly, it's wonderful to see how he's become actively involved with his classmates. Indeed, many things have changed over these 6 months. Perhaps the biggest change is how Tommy's smile has become natural. He no longer needs to hide behind long sleeves and pants. Watching my son walking home from school in his new uniform with his friends, he seems enveloped in light. I've changed too. Mrs. Parker, your recent work performance has been outstanding, my supervisor praised me the other day. By utilizing work-from-home options and managing time efficiently, I'm actually achieving better results than before. But there's an even more important change. Time to check Tommy's homework, time to make dinner together, time to play in the park on weekends. These seemingly ordinary moments have become precious treasures. We didn't need to pursue perfection. There was no need to be trapped by the image of an ideal mother. Just living and cherishing each moment, that was enough. Tommy's drawing hangs in our new apartment's living room. It's a piece he created during art class titled My Family. A mother and child's smiling faces fill the entire paper, with a large rainbow arching beside them. There's always a rainbow after the storm, Tommy explained. That's what the teacher told us. A rainbow is surely beginning to appear in our lives too. It might not be perfect in form, but that imperfection is part of our precious now. Hey, Mom, Tommy mumbled while reading a picture book on the sofa at dusk. Can we go to the zoo this Sunday? Of course we can. Our new life breathes surely within these casual conversations. Last week, another letter arrived from Greg. He wrote about attending a rehabilitation program in prison. Being freed from mother's control, I'm starting to realize the gravity of what I've done, he wrote. Martha, apparently, continues to justify her actions. Tommy's counselor says it's still too early for meetings with his father. My son also avoids talking about his father. Given the depth of his wounds, that's natural. The divorce has been finalized, and I've been granted custody. Regarding Greg's visitation rights, they're restricted until Tommy wishes to see him. This decision was made with my son's emotional recovery as the top priority. The scars haven't completely disappeared. But we have the strength to keep moving forward while carrying these wounds. Tommy's paper airplane soared high into Arizona's blue sky, like a beam of hope illuminating our future.